Hello everyone. Welcome to World Expedition's inaugural Thoughtful Traveller Q&A. My name is Donna Lawrence and I'm the Responsible Travel Manager at World Expeditions. Over the past decade, I've been very fortunate to work alongside the members of tonight's panel, seeking their guidance and direction on best practice in their field of expertise, to develop and fine-tune World Expedition's sustainable travel initiatives. We are delighted to have such a qualified panel with us tonight. Thank you all for being here. World Expeditions has over 40 years of experience operating authentic and unique adventure holidays with a genuine focus on the paths less travelled and sustainable travel. In 2001, we led the industry with our award-winning Responsible Travel Guidebook that set out to educate travellers about how they could be responsible travellers. Over the years, our Responsible Traveller Guidebook has evolved to meet the ever-changing landscape of sustainable travel. And tonight, we are pleased to launch it in its newest version as the Thoughtful Traveller. Fresh off the press, this booklet provides insights into how you can travel with minimal impact, negative impact, while maximising the positive impact you leave behind. Please take a copy home with you tonight, and for those of you tuned into our live stream, you can order your copy from our website. Before introducing the panel, I would like to explain how tonight will proceed. We will keep tonight's discussion dynamic by allocating each question and answer 3 minutes in total. At 2.5 minutes, a bell will sound to prompt the panel member to wrap up. In the past several weeks, we've invited our network of travellers the opportunity to send in some questions. We've chosen the most topical of these, and I'll be putting these questions to the panel. In addition, we've allocated time for your questions as well. Please keep your questions succinct, raise your hand, and Lexi will bring the microphone to you. Please direct your questions to the panel member by using their name first. You've no doubt noticed the cameras set up around us. Apologies to those whose view has been obscured, but we wanted to make sure the content of tonight's event was available to travellers who couldn't be here in person. Tonight's event is being filmed and streamed live over the internet. The cameras are set on the panel and myself only, and will not capture the audience, aside from the audio, of course. So please don't let the cameras stop you from asking your question. So let me introduce you to the panel. We have Ben Pearson. Ben has been active in politics and social change, campaigning for more than 20 years in Australia and overseas. He has led campaigns for NGOs such as Greenpeace, worked on climate and environmental policy in the New South Wales Public Service, and served as an advisor to Green and Labor politicians, as well as the Lord Mayor of Sydney. Ben is now Senior Campaign Manager at World Animal Protection. We also have Gail Parsonage. Gail was the founding member of the International Institute for Peace through Tourism Australia in 2001 and became president in 2010. Gail began her career in the international airline and tourism industry in sales, marketing and public relations. From there, she became a trainer and lecturer, specialising in travel and tourism, event management and business. Gail has held the position of the president of the Women's Australian Travel League, Pacific Governor for the International Federation of Women's Travel Organisation, and was a founding member and executive to the Australian Travel and Tourism Professionals. Thank you, Gail. Lee Matthews. Lee has more than a decade's experience in child rights and child protection. Lee is a recognised expert in the issues of institutionalisation, residential care of children and volunteerism. Lee is the co-founder of Rethink Orphanages Network, Better Solutions for Children, and the founder and principal consultant at Alto Global Consulting, working closely with the philanthropic, non-profit, corporate and government sectors globally to ensure that children are protected from harm. In 2009, Lee was the recipient of the Victorian Young Australian of the Year Award, the Australian Leadership Award, and the JCI 10 Outstanding Young Persons of the World Award. Lisa Vitaris. Lisa has a lifelong career in marketing and understands the power of a simple message, and she is harnessing that knowledge and her passion for the environment to drive change. Lisa believes that every traveller can make a difference just by picking up 10 pieces of litter. As an avid traveller herself, she got her hands dirty testing her ideas about litter and researching the motivations behind litter collection as part of her master's degree. World Expeditions is the first adventure travel company to partner with 10 Pieces, and we are proud to incorporate 10 Pieces into selected trips in Indonesia, Nepal, Peru, Bhutan and Tanzania. We urge other travel companies to get on board and play their part. And we have Sue Badjari. Sue is the CEO of World Expeditions. She is committed to responsible travel across our global operations. Sue is the driving force behind so many of our initiatives that go on behind the scenes, such as the introduction of a network of permanent campsites in Nepal. For those of you who don't know, these campsites were established so that our travellers played no part in contributing to the devastating effect of deforestation caused by the use of wood in tea house construction and for fuel. Tonight, Sue will speak about the issue of volunteerism, the practice of combining travel and volunteering overseas. We also have Tim McCartney-Snape. Tim successfully climbed Mount Everest by a new route without oxygen from Tibet in 1984, and then again in Nepal in 1990 during his famous Sea to Summit expedition. He has first ascents of other great peaks, including Annapurna 2, Gasherbrum 4. Tim is a member of the Fred Hollows Foundation, a director of the World Expeditions Foundation, a patron of the World Transformation Movement, and was the founder of outdoor equipment manufacturer Sea to Summit. He is the chairperson of Leave No Trace Australia. Once or twice a year, in conjunction with World Expeditions, Tim takes small groups of trekkers on expeditions to remote parts of the Himalaya and Africa. With all this experience, Tim is well qualified tonight to speak on two topics, including biosecurity and Leave No Trace, as well as equity and rights for overseas tourism employees. And lastly, we have Tom Schroeder. Tom is South Pole's Director of Marketing and Communications. He is responsible for corporate branding and positioning, campaigns, events, as well as internal and external communications. A big focus of his work is providing communication supports for South Pole's clients. Previously, Tom started Mway, a subsidiary of Migros, Switzerland's biggest retailer, as electric mobility provider. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, and personally, he's a keen surfer and an avid traveller who visited some of the areas in Indonesia most affected by rampant deforestation and the aggressive development of palm oil plantations. Now that we know our panel, I will get things started with a question from Jane Littler from Queensland. And this question is for Ben. Jane wants to know, Ben, when will a complete blanket ban be put in place to stop animals being sedated and put on show for tourists?
Okay, well, thank you for that question, and thank you for having me here tonight on behalf of World Animal Protection. The unfortunate answer is no time soon. What we're seeing around the world is that governments in countries where there are wildlife entertainment venues where animals are being treated cruelly are either not introducing laws which will outlaw cruel practices, or in the case where they actually have laws, are not enforcing them. Let's take one species, for example, that we are most suspicious is actually being drugged, tigers. Now, we have no firm evidence that tigers in countries like Thailand are drugged before they appear at places like the Old Tiger Temple or other venues where tourists can have selfies taken with them. However, it does seem rather suspicious that this apex predator sits at a venue with a tourist next to it. In normal circumstances, you would think that tiger would see that tourist as lunch, but is actually willing to sit there and be prodded and moved into different positions. And that's very disappointing. And what we're seeing is that with tigers and other species, we're moving in the wrong direction. There are more captive tigers, there are more captive elephants, there are more captive orangutans, and we need to stop that. Now, as I said, unfortunately, we can't see a blanket ban happening anytime soon, so the answer is really tourists and its travel companies. It's people who make sure that when they go overseas to see wild animals, and of course they do that because they love them, they make sure they go to venues where there's not cruelty involved. They deal with reputable operators like World Expeditions. They don't use travel companies that don't do the right thing by them and make sure they're not contributing to the problem. Travel companies have a huge role to play. We sent an undercover team to Bali last November to have a look at the wildlife entertainment venues there. It was extremely disappointing. We're going to release that report sometime this year. Extremely disappointing, the levels of cruelty we saw, the number of animals that are being held there, and the fact that the industry in Bali is increasing. What we also found, which was extremely disappointing, is that a lot of Australian travel companies and airlines are actively promoting these venues, putting them in their top 10 lists to do things like top 10 lists of things to do with kids, for God's sake. They're selling tickets to the venues. They're facilitating the search for hotels near the venues. And we really think it's time for the travel industry, not just the good players, but the entire industry, to get real about this, to really accept that what these are wildlife abusement parks. They're abusement parks. And we've got to stop contributing to this abuse. And travel companies should not only not be helping to promote these venues, but actually actively directing tourists towards venues where animals are not being treated cruelly.
Thank you, Ben. That was a great question and answer to begin with. I'd like to now take a question from the audience. Yes, this sir just here.
To the panel, I guess, generally, but to Gail, I think I'll put you on the spot, Gail. As individual travellers, what strategies can we put in place to best achieve the goals of being ambassadors of peace? So what can we do as individuals? Thanks.
Good, thank you. Well, our organisation, IIPT, we wear many hats, but our primary mission is to remind travellers, of which there are 1.3 billion of you each year, 1.3 billion travellers per year, the last stats from NWTO for 2016, and growing, that you are potentially, unbeknownst to you, ambassadors of peace. Now, all of you have travelled, I'm sure, at some stage, even it's domestically or internationally, and you are exercising your friendship, hopefully breaking down prejudices when you travel, having an open mind when you travel, protect the environment and the species that we encourage. Taking non-organisations, for example, World Expeditions, which are leading the way for best practice, that as an individual, you can actually be a peaceful traveller by adopting what we have and the credo of the peaceful traveller. Now, they may seem like motherhood statements, but they are, in fact, a reminder that people are probably doing these things but just don't mindfully do it, or just, again, we all have to be reminded. Now, in the new booklet that World Expedition have put together, the credo for the peaceful traveller is in that, and among your handouts tonight, we have also put in a copy of the credo. And if I have a moment, because you might want to read along, I don't know about our viewers, but the audience here tonight, you'll have a copy on your seats. And as a peaceful traveller, you actually become a responsible traveller. So it is your responsibility. It's not just the industry's responsibility, but it is the traveller's responsibility. And that is, if I take the liberty, and if you'd like to read along with me, it's to journey with an open mind. It is to accept with grace and gratitude the places that you visit and the people that you come across, and the diversity, which is the important one. And that helps break down any prejudices that we might have had before we started our journeys. Protect the environment and all that sustains life. So we're talking about the animals and all living creatures. Appreciate all cultures. Respect and thank our hosts, which sometimes we forget to do, but at local level, at community level, and at major international level. We should remember to thank our hosts. We are there at their agreement for us to be there. We shouldn't forget that. They welcome us. We should not impose ourselves on them. Offer our hand in friendship, and that just at all levels, not just material friendship, but meaningful friendship. Support the travel agencies and the services that are of like mind. And these are practical things that people can do. They have been doing them, but we need to be reminded. If I've got one more moment, just as an example, and I think every person here would have an example of what they have done knowingly or unknowingly to be a responsible and peaceful traveller. Many, many, many years ago, I happened to be in a place called Dahab. I don't know if other people have been there. It's in the Sinai Peninsula, and it was a bit of a hippie hangout, if that's still a common word to be used, a bit of an alternate destination in those days. And hanging out there happened to be a couple of backpackers walking along. They ate a banana and just threw the banana on the dirt. And this was before I was mindfully aware, but intuitively I thought, that's not good enough. And I went up, excused myself to these two German backpackers, happened to be German, and I said, giving them the benefit of the doubt, I said, excuse me, you might have realised you've just dropped your banana skin in the middle of the road, dirt road in the village. And they looked at me disdainfully and said, it doesn't matter. The camels will eat it. Well, yes, camels did go up and down that street. And I thought, no, that's not in a camel's diet, and you wouldn't trash that in your home village, so why trash where you're staying? Why trash their village? So I wasn't the policewoman at the time, but I did let them go. But I picked up the banana skin and found a respectable place to put it. But what I did notice that the vendors and the restaurant bar people saw what went on, and they looked at me, and I looked back at them after I disposed properly of the banana skin, and they all gave me this huge nod and a gesture of thanks. They wouldn't say it to the visitors because, in case we offend, but I could, and we should. We should all do it. We don't do it at home, and if somebody does do it at home, you'd say something. So we also have a responsibility for ourselves, but also our fellow travellers, and that is being a peaceful traveller.
Thank you, Gal. That's a fantastic example. The next question I have is for Lee, and it's from Helen Hayes, and she posed this question on our survey. Helen's from New South Wales. She says there are many excellent orphanages that will be tarred with the same brush of unethical operations. How can we stop that from happening?
Well, thank you for having me here tonight, and thanks for that question. I'm going to say something controversial straight off the bat. There's no such thing as an excellent orphanage. What there is an orphanage that practices the best practice in the care of children in an institutional environment. What we do know from over 70 years of research is that growing up in an orphanage is inherently harmful for all children. It is bad for children to grow up in orphanages. It harms their emotional and their physical development, their cognition. It also results in impacts that are lifelong and intergenerational. And if we know that children do better in families and not in orphanages, then we should be putting all of our efforts into making sure that all children get to grow up in a family, which is their right. It is a right under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child that children should have the right to grow up in a family, and if it is not their family, then another family. The question that's asked is a really common one. A lot of people have had very personal experiences and emotional experiences of volunteering in an orphanage, sponsoring children in an orphanage, visiting, and those experiences, when challenged, can result in really conflicted emotions and feelings about what you've done or what you might have done. But this argument between good and bad orphanages is really unhelpful. Certainly, there are really corrupt orphanages that actively exploit children for financial gain. Children are bought, sold, leased into and between orphanages. They're actively exploited in these places. They're starved because skinny, sick children elicit more donations than healthy, happy children. They're denied access to medical care for the same reasons, and education. Those orphanages are certainly bad, but there are orphanages run by very good people that have the best of intentions and only want to help. But the fact is there are better ways to care for children, and having tourists and volunteers come in and engage with these children on a short-term basis is really, really damaging for these children, and it's contributing to an industry that is worth millions and millions of dollars, and it's actually driving the separation of children from their families. So if we don't have orphans, we have to go out and get them to populate the orphanages to meet the demand for what we call orphan experiences. People want to help. They want to go and help orphans while they're travelling. But there aren't enough orphans. So we have to go and get them from poor villages. And that's where children are being trafficked. They're being coerced into coming to the orphanage. Their parents are being coerced under the guise of a better education or a better life. And in some cases, they're simply trafficked. So that question is a really, really hard one to answer, but what we need to know is that there are better ways, and there are many organisations out there that are trying to get kids out of orphanages and into homes and trying to prevent this kind of practice.
Thank you, Lee. And that was, although it was a difficult question to answer, it was really your answer that you gave us was very insightful, and it gives us lots to think about, that's for sure. I was just wondering, does anyone have a question for Lisa from 10 Pieces? Sure, thank you. Sorry, thanks. Thank you.
Can picking up 10 pieces of litter make a difference, or is it a bit of a token gesture? That's my question.
Very good question. And I guess on an individual level, if you are just picking up 10 pieces of litter, sure, the world's going to be 10 pieces cleaner, but the real value comes when you get multiple people picking up 10 pieces of litter. So on a World Expeditions trip, if you get 10 people picking up 10 pieces, that's 100 pieces. If you get another 10 tour groups coming in, that quickly becomes 1,000 pieces, and so on. And you get multiple people coming through the same areas over and over and over again, and that can quickly become less of a token gesture and make more of a difference to the environment. The other thing is people tend to pick up more than 10 pieces, which is really nice to see from the surveys that we've done. So they're picking up on average about 100 pieces, which does add up over time with all of those tour groups coming through. The other thing that we've noticed is, and it's based on research, litter attracts other litter. So in areas where we've been able to completely remove litter from an area, it tends not to reappear. So it does make a difference. We have a social phenomenon as well. When lots of people are picking up litter, other people tend to join in, and that just further amplifies the effect of picking up 10 pieces. We had a really nice example of one of the World Expeditions tour groups in Bhutan at Tiger's Nest Monastery, whereby a group was picking up litter, and then other travellers actually ended up joining in. Locals ended up joining in as well, and then monks started blessing everybody, which was just such a nice scene. So really positive experience there. The other thing that you can start to do when you are picking up litter in a certain area is start to analyse it and work out what's really driving the problem behind it in the first place. So in Nepal, could be Mars bar wrappers from all the hungry trekkers. In Ghana, it's plastic water sachets. That's how everybody drinks water over there for the most part. Mount Cameroon in West Africa, it tends to be plastic whiskey sachets because that's how people actually get up the mountain apparently. So once you work out what the biggest contributors are to litter, you can actually start to do something about it. And World Expeditions helps with packaging, for example, by actually encouraging people to cut back on their packaging, buy products with minimal packaging or no packaging at all, so that really helps. But perhaps the biggest difference of all is actually the education benefits of 10 pieces. So it's not just about actually the act of picking up the litter and disposing of it elsewhere, it's about educating other travellers and the local communities. So 10 pieces has been able to make quite a significant difference, changing locals' perceptions and behaviour. There was an example of one of the porters in Bataan on the Chomolari trek, and he knew that litter was bad, but he didn't know what to do with it, so he'd just put it under a rock, which was great. It kind of took it out of the way, but then with 10 pieces, he realised that litter is actually bad, and the best way to dispose of it is to carry it out. So that's completely changed his behaviour. So when other people start to see the good work that people are doing, they start to emulate that behaviour as well. So yes, if you're doing 10 pieces on your own, I think it could be seen as a token gesture, but the power of travellers, the collective power of individuals is what makes it so powerful, and the educational benefits for all the locals as well.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I was just wondering if anybody has a question for Tim McCartney-Snape.
Good question. Unfortunately, not necessarily so. And it boils down primarily to economics. And if you're in a poorer country, developing country, there's a lot of pressure to make sure the bottom line is a healthy one. And an easy way to cut expenses in places that don't adhere to regulations so much, as in a lot of other countries, especially in the developing world, then wages and conditions are an easy way to cut costs. And so you get workers being exploited. The other reason, especially in South Asia, is cultural, because traditionally in a Hindu society there's a caste system. Although it's no longer recognised and supported by governments, it's still firmly entrenched, unfortunately, which means that people are basically born into a station in life. If you're a high caste person, you do certain things. If you're a low caste person, then you get basically the crap jobs, and you get exploited. So that's a long-term change to change that. So if a company like World Expeditions is operating from outside, from a country like Australia, where by and large people follow regulations and have higher standards, then you can go to another country, and the responsible thing to do, of course, is to impose those better standards. May I say there's also an economic driver in that as well, because for World Expeditions, for instance, when World Expeditions customers go, say, trekking in Nepal, and they see a porter being mistreated, then of course it reflects badly on World Expeditions. So there is actually an economic imperative, although of course the higher one is a moral one, that those workers be treated well. And this has been borne out. When I first started going to Nepal back in the late 70s, porter conditions were really bad. And it was because the local operators were just allowed to do what they always did. And so they treated their porters in particular, who tended to be from lower castes and from less fortunate backgrounds, really badly. And over time, that has changed, and the change has been driven by responsible outside operators like World Expeditions.
Thank you very much, Tim. I was just wondering whether we've got any questions in the audience for Tom about carbon emissions.
Yeah, hi Tom. Just wondering if you can tell us about carbon offsets and how carbon offsets really do help mitigate the impact of global warming.
Okay, well, thanks for the question, and thanks for having me here tonight. Before talking about carbon offsets, I should really talk about emissions, and I should maybe start with our individual carbon footprints. So each of us, with all our actions, we cause emissions, and depending on what we do, these emissions can be higher or smaller. You can cycle, or you can take a bus, you can drive a car, you can fly on a plane, you can do different things that have different emission outcomes. And in order to arrive at the concept of a carbon offset, you first need to understand the individual carbon footprint. And then what generally needs to happen first, before considering even compensating your individual emissions, is you should look for ways to reduce your carbon footprint. So eat less meat, eat no meat, cycle, and all the examples I gave before. And then the concept of the carbon offset is actually a way that you can further reduce or even neutralize your carbon footprint, and that happens in an indirect way. So with the purchase of a carbon offset, you're basically financing emissions reductions that are happening elsewhere. So in order to visualize how that works is emission reduction projects get developed mainly in developing countries because it is economically more feasible to do it there. The dollar just goes farther just because of the level of technological development that countries like Australia or countries in Europe and North America have. You just manage to reduce more emissions in those countries by, for example, financing projects such as chlorine filters, water dispensers, solar PV, so solar panels on roofs, wind, and so forth. And what then happens is you take the status quo, you look at the baseline, and you say, okay, this is how many emissions are being caused at the moment. So the example I always like to give is a plant I visited last year, a tapioca starch plant in Thailand, where you use large amounts of water to wash the tapioca starch out of the plant. And then this water just sits in large ponds and starts fermenting, and methane or methane emissions are being caused, and they just evaporate into the atmosphere, 25 times more lethal to the atmosphere than CO2. And what these projects then do, the emissions reduction projects, is the methane is captured. It's an old technology from the 60s, really. And it's being used to fuel a generator, so that instead of purchasing diesel, for example, you just use the locally generated electricity and at the same time avoid the emissions. And the way that these emissions reduction projects and the offsets that you purchase work is you actually turn this project economically feasible. So it's in the world of emissions, it's called its additionality. So it wouldn't have happened without your intervention. So companies like World Expeditions actually drive this change and make it happen in the first place. And that's the concept of carbon emissions in a nutshell, I hope.
It is a complex topic, but thank you for explaining it so succinctly. Thank you, Tom. I now have a question about volunteerism for Sue, and this one's come from our survey from Harriet from Victoria, and she asks, what is your view on volunteering? Is it giving or is it taking?
That's a really good question. Look, I think the most important thing to state from the outset is that we are not just on the cusp of volunteerism. We're actually riding the wave of something that is incredibly popular at the present time and has been for the last decade, but growing over the decade. And that with that, you know, the appetite for volunteerism has morphed into two main sectors, being those that involve activities to do with children in orphanages or in schools, or interactions with wildlife. So that sort of interfaces really well with what Lee and yourself have been talking about this evening. And that, you know, that those two sectors are obviously very vulnerable, and there is very open to exploitation. So I think the important thing in terms of giving and taking comes down to the physical project, and travellers having a very good understanding of what the project is, and being very discerning about what their involvement is going to transpire into something positive and meaningful, that gives a real, and that there's a real need at the end of the day for the local community or the environment that is going to deliver something tangible, meaningful and sustainable for that environment. The other thing, of course, is that I think travellers need to ask some very potent questions, and they need to research very carefully when they are embarking on volunteerism. And the things they should be asking are things like, how was this project sourced? Was the real need identified? Do I feel comfortable with that? Do I have the skill set to participate in this? If I'm going to be involved in teaching, am I a qualified teacher? If I'm going to be prescribing medical treatment, am I qualified to do that? You know, what is going to be the real benefit for the community, and is it sustainable into the long term? So these all become very, very important qualifications for a traveller to make. And what I would say is that is very difficult, and that we would always defer travellers to the experts. So people like, you know, No More Orphanages and World Animal Protection and the IIPT and Leave No Trace have fantastic websites, and they are the authorities. They have a very rich environment that travellers can go to get a better understanding, and also to talk to experts if they are considering embarking on these types of adventures.
Thank you, Sue. Are there any other questions in the audience? Yes, sir.
Is there any database on eco-friendly B&Bs in the world? We are particularly interested in Europe, US and Canada.
Is there anybody on the panel that feels like they can answer that question? Okay, we might be able to help you with an answer to that question after tonight's event. Thank you. It is a good question, but we'll seek out an answer for you following the event. Thank you, sir. I'm wondering if there's anyone in the audience that has a question for Ben. Sorry. Yes. Thank you.
Sorry, I shot my hand up
That's
hoping
okay.
to ask the whole panel, if I may. In the travel industry and kind of the big players in the travel industry and airlines and travel agents, how can the public do more to put pressure on them to make sure that what they're offering is sustainable, is caring about the issues you guys have discussed? How can we the people, put more pressure on them?
I think Ben might have an answer for you.
Thanks, that is a great question. And the answer is pretty simple. Make it clear to them that when you go to their websites, you want them to have made sure that they're not promoting and selling tickets to venues which promote cruelty to animals, okay? Because so much of the cruelty that happens is behind the scenes. You know, you can't tell yourself whether a particular venue involves cruelty or not. Those travel agents and those airlines have been told for years, you've got to stop promoting venues that contribute to animal cruelty. They should be doing a full audit of their websites and making sure that the cruel venues aren't being promoted. They should be making sure that they're following the lead of Instagram, which recently said, all right, the problem we have here is that people take a selfie with something like a sloth, they upload it to Instagram. It creates the sense that that's okay, that that's a socially acceptable thing to do. If you now go onto Instagram and search for something like #slothselfie, it has a content advisory warning that comes up. It says, you shouldn't be doing this. This is a thing that it contributes to animal cruelty. Why don't you go to these websites and learn more? We'd like to see the big airlines and the online travel companies, you know who they are, have a similar system. So if I try to get onto something like the Tiger Temple in Thailand, boom, up comes the warning. It's contributing to the cruelty towards tigers. Go to this website and learn more. So these companies have a massive role to play in being part of the solution. At the moment, quite frankly, they're a part of the problem.
Thank you, Ben. Are there any more questions in the audience for Ben, perhaps, or any of the other panel members?
I've got a two-part question for Ben. Due to population growth, there is less space than ever for wildlife. I travel to a lot of places where this is an issue. What do you think of the concept of animals paying to play? So commercial hunting, for example, X number of animals are allocated for the hunt to bring money in to justify their existence. And part two, your thoughts on improving the animals' conditions in certain activities rather than a blanket ban. So that's something I've seen with elephant riding, for example. They're saying they can't ban it. There's not enough space for wild elephants. So let's just improve their conditions and keep it going.
Okay, so why don't I deal with the first one? We certainly couldn't support anything which involves animals being hunted on a commercial basis for no other reason than that gave a quick thrill to a human being to shoot a wild animal. That's just grotesque. You might be able to try to dress that up as well. It has a broader conservation benefit in some other way, but no, that's just something we really could never support. There are other ways in which we can support and protect habitat for wild animals. We can do that by working with countries, in Africa and Asia to introduce programs where we help them protect that habitat and help them do things which protect the animals that rely on that habitat. We certainly don't need to be hunting and perpetuating the just appalling sport of trophy hunting to do that. In the second case, look, that's right. What we certainly don't just do is say, okay, we just need to shut down elephant venues, say in Thailand tomorrow. It's just not that easy. It comes back to something Tim was talking about as well, the economic reality. There are people who depend on those venues for their livelihood, and they feed their families on the money that they earn at them, and we're respectful of that. So what World Animal Protection does is we're actually working with existing venues and with the Thai government to actually try to transition venues to higher welfare standards. And we're trying to establish venues where people who go to these places because they love animals can actually go to a place where they can see these animals, experience them, but not contribute to cruelty, because they're not actually going to a venue which treats those animals badly and subjects them to things like rides or selfies or things like that. So certainly that kind of transition and getting the industry to a place where it's giving people what they want, which the experience of a wild animal, without contributing to cruelty, is something that we're very involved in.
Thank you, Ben. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Hello, I've got a question for Tim. Hi, Tim. I'm just wondering if you can tell us why it's important for livelihoods to be created for local people by tourism operators.
Well, even in Australia, tourism contributes considerably to the economy, i.e. jobs. So even in Australia, a lot of people rely on tourism for jobs, but in places, keep going back to Nepal because I've a lot of experience there, like Nepal, a lot of people simply don't have jobs and they don't have access to getting any cash from any other activity that they may have been born into, i.e. farming. So a lot of people across the Himalaya actually are subsistence farmers, and they will, to use as an example, supplement their income by working in the trekking and mountaineering industry by being either porters or being involved in the catering or as guides if they work their way up and show the proficiency for it. So tourism is really very, very important for those people. Without tourism, without trekking, they wouldn't have a job. Now, you could see it. When I first went to that part of the world, they said, porters can carry your pack. And I said, what? But I don't want anyone to carry my pack. I'm fit and healthy, and I couldn't bear someone carrying my pack. I'm going to carry it myself. Fair enough. But over time, of course, I was realising that I was doing someone out of a job. I could well afford to pay that person. And so, I got a bit lazy, and I conceded that that was an okay thing. And it goes back to the original question I answered before, is you've got to make sure that the working standards are put in place so that those people are not exploited and don't. And it's very easily done because, for instance, you have a certain number of loads, you employ a certain number of porters, and you think, oh, we've got a few more loads. Oh, well, we'll just top up each one's loads, and a porter ends up carrying a non-standard load of 40 or 50 kilograms rather than 30 kilograms, which is not good because they're not generally paid anymore, even if they could physically handle it. But to this day, there are still professional porters in the foothills of the Himalaya, people who make most of their income from working on treks. And a lot of the porters are also part-timers, students, for instance, who in their holidays want to earn some much-needed cash. So, tourism is really very, very important especially across the developing world, not just in Australia.
Thank you, Tim. I was just wondering if anyone has a question for Gail.
Hi, Gail.
Hi.
Sorry. I've heard about your peace parks before. Could you tell me a bit more about the purpose of these parks?
Thank you. Peace parks are a very interesting part of our organisation. Our organisation has been going over 30 years, and it was an initiative that started in Canada for their 125th anniversary of Canada. And somebody came up with the initiative to have 125 peace parks across Canada to be a place of ceremony, to be a place of contemplation. And this came under the IIPT initiative to help to do that. And we have spread that concept throughout the world. And we're on a mission. We've got about 450 peace parks that are tourism related. Now, there are peace parks all over the world. But what we try to do is peace parks that are related to very iconic tourism attractions, be it man-made or natural. So, for example, at Victoria Falls on the Zambia side, we've inaugurated a peace park there. You say, well, you know, what happens at a peace park? Now, some places, it is a point of gathering, often for ceremonial purposes. It's very hard to, when you talk about peace, because peace is intangible. So what is peace for you is different to peace to you is different to you. So there's peace within yourself, there's peace with the environment, there's peace with the family, there's peace with the world. Peace is many more things than just an absence of war. So what we try to do is say, let's take an iconic tourism attraction or place and let's redesignate that and as also a peace park to come together to celebrate. I often like to use the word to recalibrate. If you go to this place, recalibrate what is your intention as a traveller. Are you here just for drug, sex, rock and roll and shopping? Or are we here for a higher ideal of what we can contribute back to society? We also do it, encourage people where we have these parks of 450, that they reread the credo of the peaceful traveller, and that's helping them to recalibrate. We say that these places are a place to be, not to do. And in this sacred place, at this moment, and they can be big or small, that at this place, that no ill will be done by me or to me or by me. So we actually have a piece of place on earth that is sacred and that you can honestly say this is a peaceful environment. And we just have to have more and more of them. And so I'm open to all people to help us with that. It's an ongoing project, I can tell you. We actually have our first one in Australia, and it's a real work in progress, and I can't tell you too much, but hopefully we've got 2 or 3. Anyway, but they're all over the world and growing.
Thank you very much, Gail. We'll look forward to hearing about that peace park.
Please.
I actually have a question here for Lisa. It's come from Bill from Western Australia from our online survey. And Bill asks, I've seen garbage tips in places like India and Nepal. The litter is just relocated to be scattered by the wind, cows and goats. What happens to litter when it's collected through the 10 Pieces initiative?
Yeah, that's a really, really important part of 10 Pieces, litter disposal. And right from the onset, from when I came up with the idea, litter disposal was at the heart of everything that I was thinking about. So with 10 Pieces, I actually studied as part of my Masters in International Marketing. I did a business project to actually determine whether 10 Pieces was a good idea to launch, whether any travellers were going to be interested by it, whether any responsible travel managers of different tour companies were going to be interested by it. And through that project, obviously, there was a resounding yes, which was really great, which is why I'm here today, and particularly thanks to World Expeditions. But as part of that research, litter disposal came out as the biggest problem ever. And there were examples of other tour groups where they had specific litter picking groups. And on those litter picking groups, there was one example in Egypt. The group had gone to great effort and with all their goodwill, they'd picked up a whole bunch of litter in the desert. Unfortunately, it wasn't collected properly, and the next morning it was just blowing around in the same area. So very, very disappointing and demotivating for the people that were picking it up. So it is a big problem. The way that we address it with World Expeditions is actually twofold. So one is the collection of litter itself. And we have these very fancy bags, thanks to Cedar Summit, and Leave No Trace and everyone else involved, World Youth Adventures, etc. So they are leak-proof and they're very durable, and everyone collects their litter in those bags. In Nepal, every single traveller is given one of those bags. They easily clip onto your pack, so litter can't escape. So that's the first thing. When you're actually collecting it, making sure that you don't just drop it back on the trail that you're on. The next thing is actually the disposal itself, which is the most important part. And the main thing behind litter disposal is just making sure that whatever environment you're in, that you dispose of it in the best way possible for that environment or for that location. So we have a few different examples depending on the countries that we're picking up litter in. In Nepal, for example, incineration is actually the best way in certain areas, and Tim here has invented his version of an incinerator, which is actually really cost effective, really easy to make, really easy to carry. It's a clean burn, and that's how litter is disposed of. So at the end of the day, everyone gets their packs, they empty them, they're encouraged to pick up plastic. Certain types of plastic can be burnt, so they're encouraged to pick up certain types of plastic, which they're educated about. They're encouraged to pick up litter as well, and then it's cleanly burnt in these incineration containers. Thanks, Tim. In Bhutan, for example, I went on the Chomolari trek about a year ago with World Expeditions. It was really interesting. We tried to use these incineration containers, but the locals were actually quite upset, and they said it would offend the mountain deities. So we weren't able to actually incinerate like we'd planned. So we had to quickly change plans, and we used pack animals that were carrying all the food on the way in to carry out the litter. So it's really about getting that whatever the best way possible is for litter disposal in the area. In Peru, we actually have an agreement with World Expeditions and Turismo Cuida. They actually take all the plastic water bottles that are collected, which is the main source of rubbish, and they recycle them at a plant, at a series of plants in Lima. So main thing is really just collecting litter in a bag so that it can't blow out, and then disposing of it in the right way possible for whatever area you're in.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I've got a question here that also came for Lee. It came in on the survey. It's from Nicole from New South Wales, and it's she asks, I've read in the media recently that the government has launched a campaign to discourage Australians from engaging in overseas volunteer programs. What impact will this have on orphans in countries like Nepal and Cambodia?
So the campaign that the Australian government has released about 2 weeks ago is not designed to discourage volunteerism. It is designed to encourage smart volunteering. That's the name of the campaign. And it talks about various ways to ensure that your volunteer experience is founded in the best possible way. So doing your research, making sure that you understand the impact of your programs, that you're qualified to go and do this, and it actively discourages volunteering in orphanages. This has come out of the Modern Slavery Inquiry, or the Inquiry into Establishing a Modern Slavery Act in Australia. This was a federal government inquiry that happened last year, and the final report was released at the end of 2017, and part of that recommended that there be a blanket ban on volunteering in orphanages. So for Australians to go and volunteer in orphanages would actually become a criminal act and be legislated against. That hasn't happened, and we don't know if that will happen or if some version of that will happen. The Act is being written currently, and we should know more further into the year. As for the impact that any legislation or campaigns might have on orphans, I think a really important thing to understand is that the number of orphans is actually quite low. The number of vulnerable children is very, very high, but the number of children that truly have no family, no living family, whether it's biological parents or kinship care, so wider family, is very, very low. And it's decreasing all the time, particularly in the countries that have the highest rates of orphanages. So in Cambodia, over the last decade or so, we saw a 75% increase in orphanages, despite the number of actual orphans reducing by a very similar number over the same period. So as for what will happen to those children that live in orphanages, I think what we will see, and we're starting to see that from governments in places like Nepal and Cambodia, is a really concerted effort to get kids out of orphanages and into homes. And we as travellers and humans and people that want to support vulnerable children need to not undermine those efforts of those governments to get those kids into families and not participate in products that offer the experience of engaging with an orphan.
Thank you very much, Lee. Are there any questions for Sue about volunteerism, perhaps? I've got 2 questions up the front here. Thanks, Lexi. Okay, that's great. We can take Soren's first and then yours.
So many companies claim their volunteering opportunities are good. What are the ethical considerations I should be aware of when choosing where and how to volunteer?
Look, this is a very quickly evolving space, and really the narrative needs to change to what the government is stating, that we need to evolve into being smart volunteers and doing our research, as Lee's also alluded to. I mean, I a couple of years ago, deliberately involved myself in something that I totally didn't agree with, but I wanted to see what this type of volunteering was, which was in Africa. It was in Zimbabwe, and it was Walking with the Lions experience. And I engaged in it, and I very quickly learned that it was through the questioning the people running that program. What were the long-term goals of the program? Yes, to basically take the cubs from the adult lions and habituate them to an extent, and then take them back into the wild. On questioning them as to what successes they'd had with that project, over 8 years that they've been operating, they had 1 lion successfully set back into the wild. So, thousands and thousands of dollars pour through that environment each day, with the number of travellers who want to walk with the lion. So, we can see that there is automatically a problem there. And, this is the type of thing that the smart volunteer program will espouse. It's doing the research and asking the questions. And I would also say that, volunteerism has evolved over young and old people wanting to get involved. Lots of school groups, for example, will unwittingly travel up and visit orphanages. So we know that's wrong. That's been stamped out of our program for at least 5 years now. So we were probably ahead of the industry in that regard. Elephant riding has been only very recently, deemed as a very, cruel act, and that tourists should avoid doing that. But there is so many good projects that people can get involved with, and it is about ascertaining and consulting with a local community, and it becomes a very good collaborative arrangement where people work side by side. We're not taking away work from other people. We're getting the funds into through the programs that World Expeditions, for example, offer with our community project travel program. And at the end of the day, it is sustainable and it is collaborative, and it has a very, very positive and enduring outcome. So it is good volunteering if done in the right way.
Thank you, Sue. I think we've got time for one more question down the front here.
My question is of Tom, and that is, Tom, what do you say to people who will say to you, you shouldn't be getting on an airplane and fly because of the emissions you're causing, you should be travelling locally?
Well, what would I say? That's first of all, that's a a very valid point and it's a valid statement, and air travel should definitely be minimized as much as possible, but I think with what I explained before, then the carbon offset would be a viable alternative, or like a recourse really for people who want to travel, who need to travel. I mean, there's lots of video conferencing that is possible these days. I'm talking to Europe every day and I fly there very rarely, so there are definitely examples of where that's possible, but carbon offsets are a way of reducing the emissions that you would be causing in such a circumstance. And maybe I can elaborate a little bit more on the concept, because we heard so many great initiatives here and so many positive influences that are happening in these countries that are impacted by international travel, international air travel. And what I just wanted to point out as well is that carbon offsets are really the currency behind driving a lot of these changes that are occurring on the ground. And how is that possible? It's possible through these streams of finance that I described before, where companies like World Expeditions actually make this possible. And how do they choose these projects? Well, there are also more exciting projects than the methane I explained before. There's reforestation projects, there's lots of cook stove projects, lots of them happening in Nepal, and many of these projects, or all of these projects, are actually having lots of other beneficial impacts on the ground besides just reducing carbon, and these are now aligned, at least in our case, we align them with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, which were put into place in 2016 as a follow-up to the Millennium Development Goals, and there's 17 goals. You might be aware of lots of them. No poverty, improve education, gender equality, climate change is one of them, and so forth. So many of these projects actually contribute positively to what's happening on the ground. So I guess you could kind of say that that's an argument for traveling more. Well, I guess not really, but within what you can kind of feel responsible for yourself, you just make that. And maybe also more generally, and I think that's probably something that is common here for all of us, is it's all about individual choices and driving this change on our individual level, because we as consumers have a lot of power. I mean, you go to Taronga Zoo and you hear about the MSC, so sustainable fishing, there's sustainable forestry and so forth. So there are lots of things that you can influence to make a positive difference.
Thank you very much, Tom. Well, that actually brings us to the end of our Q&A tonight. If you still have questions that you would like answered and to ask a panel member, you're welcome to stay back after the event. We'll all be here for at least half an hour to answer any lingering questions. And those of you watching online, you can leave a comment on our Q&A thread on the World Expeditions Facebook page, where our panellists will answer your questions as soon as they can. Many thanks to everyone involved in tonight's event. It has certainly been enlightening, and I'm sure that we'll all take away something special for our next adventure, some little bit of advice or an information tidbit that we've been given tonight by our expert panel. So I'd like to thank the panel